Hey, just a heads up, today's episode deals with some really difficult themes. It's all about Indigenous suicide, so mentally prepare yourself for that.
I'm Angela Voipierre.
And I'm Stephen Smiley, and this is The Signal. So there's been a spate of suicides in Australia this summer. 5 girls in a 9-day period, all aged between 12 and 15, and all First Nations. And it's happened before, and it's just as hard to make sense of it every time. But could there be something big that we're missing?
Nearly 100% of the suicides of First Nations people are of people living below the poverty line. And the deeper below that poverty line, the higher the rate of suicide.
On this episode of The Signal, we meet the family of a 16-year-old Aboriginal girl who died by suicide in WA. And we ask, what's the pattern to these deaths? Could they have less to do with race and more to do with poverty than we realise? That's today's episode. Okay, so you might not have heard about it because it didn't actually get all that much coverage, but 5 Indigenous kids died by suicide over the summer. And yesterday, the problem was back in the news again because a WA coronial inquest into Indigenous suicide handed down its final report, looking at 13 deaths between 2012 and 2016, including a 10-year-old. And there's a reason, right, that this story is so hard to talk about. And it's because always when you're telling a story, you want to try and make sense of it. And it's just about impossible to do here, or at least it seems that way to begin with.
Yeah, but then we spoke to someone who works with First Nations people at risk of suicide and families dealing with the aftermath of a suicide. And this guy, Gerry Georgatos, has a really unusual take on this issue, and we're going to hear from him a bit later in the episode. But first, we noticed that the stories about these deaths, when they happen, they usually lack a certain level of like humanising detail.
Yeah, so we wanted to start today's episode in a slightly different way by hearing from a woman named Grace Cockey. Grace is 40 and she lives in Gosnells, which is a suburb in the south of Perth. And almost a year ago, she lost her eldest daughter, Linda, who was 16 years old, to suicide.
She was happy-go-lucky, smart, intelligent. She just got boss.
So as you can hear, it wasn't a great phone line, but we thought it was so important to talk to Grace about this that we're using the audio anyway, and we're going to do our best to help you understand it.
What was she like when she was very young? Like, did she kind of...
She wanted to know this and that and everything, so I told her the truth of every answer, so she knew.
Do you remember what her favourite game was when she was really young? Like what kind of games she'd play?
I think I Spy.
I like that one too. I think why kids like that game, right, is because it puts them in charge. Like they know the answer.
Yeah.
And then everyone else has to ask them.
Yeah, no, she always liked being in charge and everything,
Yeah. So when Grace told me all about Linda, it was obvious how badly she was still grieving. She told me all about what kind of kid she was. That she liked school and she used to play footy and netball. Apparently she was a pretty good GS and not bad in defence either. She would go late night shopping with her friends and argue with her sisters over little things. So in all these ways, she was a really normal teenager. Her mum actually describes Linda as a pretty upbeat kid who never showed any sign of considering suicide. In fact, more often than not, she would actually be the person trying to cheer other people up.
She's seeing people down or whatever, she'll want to help them out, keep them strong. And yeah, she looked after a lot of her sisters and friends,
What would she do to make people laugh?
Like, she'll talk or dance.
Did she listen to much music?
Yeah, she loves music, she loves singing. Got a beautiful voice.
And Grace says she's pretty much in the dark about the way Linda was thinking in the lead up to her death. Although fair to say life hadn't exactly been straightforward for their family. Grace had spent 14 months in rehab for a drug problem before she was reunited with her kids in late 2017.
October got out, November, December, January, February, and then March she passed away. 4 months before she passed away, yeah. And I say it's very unfair.
And then on top of that, Linda was being bullied.
Yes, her life did become a bit more normal, but then she ended up getting bullied by her family online phone, so yeah.
What was happening there?
I don't know, because she had an argument with one of her cousins, and her cousin's brother and everything started writing her messages and,
Do you know what they were saying to her?
Swearing at her. I sent messages.
Did she tell anyone that was happening, or did she keep it to
No,
herself?
she showed me. I told her, don't worry about it, don't let it get to her.
And was that going on for a little while before she died? Or was it?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know how long it was going on?
For months.
Months.
Yeah.
And after months of this, Linda was at this party one night and there was a particularly bad scene where she was bullied again, this time face-to-face by a group of other kids. And it was later that night that her mum found her body.
So this is where Gerry Georgatos comes into the picture. He's a suicide prevention researcher and the coordinator of the National Indigenous Critical Response Service. And this is when he showed up to offer the family some support.
My first impressions of Grace and her 5 remaining children of the Salt of the Earth family, stalwart. They do live in a public housing rental. They do it tough, but they've always kept it together. And they live way below the poverty line, not just in proximity or just below the poverty line. They live way below the poverty line. There's a crushing poverty that they live every day.
I guess, you know, it's probably a struggle for a lot of people who don't have any contact with this world to imagine. Just describe to me this world, if you can. Like when you drive up, what do you see? What are the features of life that are straight away very, very different to what a lot of middle-class Australians would be used to?
Some of these households become physically almost shanty-like because of the pressures upon them. 4, 5 or 6 children, single-parent family member, and then other family members who are homeless or living in poverty themselves. But when you first approach Grace's home, for instance, it's a humble dwelling. It's very modest. It doesn't have the gardens because there's a utility bill that comes at, it's not affordable for them. The water, these types of hits or whatever, right, which are taken for granted by others, are unaffordable for those living in public housing rentals.
And that poverty that Gerry is describing, he says that's something that he sees time and time again in the families that he goes to help.
14% of Australians live below the poverty line, but 40% of our First Nations brothers and sisters live below the poverty line. 40%, 2.5 times differential from the rest of the nation to First Nations people who live below the poverty line. And that also correlates with the suicide toll. The suicide toll of First Nations brothers and sisters is 2.5 times the rate of the suicide rate of non-Indigenous Australians.
So there's an exact parallel there.
Correlation. There's an absolute correlation, and I argue this above all things.
Okay, so presumably Gerry is not saying that race has nothing to do with the high rates of suicide in the Indigenous community.
No. And I don't think he or anyone would ever try to say that those numbers are a coincidence. He's talking more about the nature of the link and that there is this third-party factor, poverty, that Gerry reckons doesn't get taken into account.
It's poverty, and I'll explain that. This is the most important point that's being made. And I'll be at odds with anyone who wants to be at odds with me. I've lived this space for a long time, and I've lived suicide prevention and postvention. So in the end, being First Nations alone of heritage isn't a liability, isn't putting yourself at risk, because the startling and little-known narrative is that suicides of First Nations people living above the poverty line are almost negligible.
And
They're
lower,
very few,
lower. You
and
were
much
saying,
less,
yeah.
and much less than non-Indigenous suicides of people living above the poverty line. So go figure. It's about improving life circumstances. So First Nations identity is not an issue in itself. They're driven to succeed, those who are living above the poverty line. First Nation students at university are now like the migrant born from culturally diverse, language diverse backgrounds from socioeconomic disadvantage, the most likely to succeed. And they've got an agency that living above the poverty line gives them. It's nearly 100% of the suicides of First Nations people are of people living below the poverty line. And the deeper below that poverty line, the higher the rate of suicide.
Linda died. And Ange, when you spoke to Grace, did you get a sense for how she was coping?
Yeah, and even with all the really practical and also emotional support from family and from people like Gerry, Grace is still, as you can imagine, in a pretty bad way. And she said something really striking to me. She said she can't find any peace.
When she went, she took a big part of me with her too, you know. Her life has changed. And I get up like every night at the same time when she passed away. Like I could feel it.
Gerry, I think that's everything I wanted to ask. I suppose Grace is, speaking to her, she talked about still waking up every night at the same time.
Yeah.
It's so clear that she's still in the middle of her grief. What kind of prospect do families who've suffered something like this have of recovering?
If they've got support, and if they've got ongoing support and a sense of relentlessness in that support, their trauma recovery is profound. They contextualize and come to terms to understanding. So we're on this earth for a brief time. We should be there for each other as much as we can. You can disable trauma. The early intervention is what actually matters. And this is what I talk to government about, Commonwealth and states and all jurisdictions. And it's about early intervention. There's a greater social return. Yes, it costs a little bit more, but who cares? We're not on this earth forever and a day.
So if you ask Gerry, it's getting there quickly and in person after someone has died that gives families the best chance to recover. But what more could and should Australia be doing for Indigenous people in extreme poverty and at risk, like Linda was?
Outreach is a missing link. The critically vulnerable are not going to use an app, are not going to pick up a phone, are not going to put up their hand and say, I'm in trouble. Their families have little agency and struggle to actually, because they're living so far below the poverty line, and they don't know who to turn to. They're not going to walk through any door. They're not going to walk into the offices of any major service. So yes, we've got an investment in a lot of 9-to-5 services, but the critically vulnerable need outreach.